what have I done here? Since we visited Thornbridge last year for our series on how to homebrew Jaipur, I've been continuously returning to the notion of brewing classic historical beers. While we were there, we had the joy of witnessing the Burton Union set that Thornbridge have brought back to life, and they're producing some of the most delicious cask and bottle conditioned beers that I've ever had the privilege to try. And what's more, it wasn't just the beers that were being produced, it was the team there, their passion for not only the beer that was being crafted, but the preservation of a historical brewing artefact that is the Burton Union. But also as part of that episode, we visited the wonderful Richard at Wheatlow Brewery, who is one of the homebrewers here in the UK that is pushing boundaries and capacity to new levels. He's even built his own small-scale Burton Union. That ingenuity really captivated me and had me continuously returning over the last year or so to the idea of brewing historical beer styles, but also the methods that go into it. Some of which we've featured on the channel here before, including the historical porter that Rob and I brewed just before Christmas. The idea of building some kind of smaller but more accessible Burton Union setup, it's always been there in the background, and I always get a little bit stuck on it. And whilst I was pondering on this notion of like potentially trying to create something that would work on a single vessel, I started connecting the dots from something from when I was younger. Actually, a beer that really ignited my passion for beer, and most importantly, cask beer. Now, the beer that I'm talking about here really was the start of my love for cask beer. And that beer was Brakspear Bitter. It was a beer that was brewed just a few miles away from my stomping grounds where I grew up, and one that we actually added a clone recipe onto the website a few years ago. Now, Brakspear was founded in 1711 in Henley-on-Thames and brewed on the same site for almost 300 years. It became one of those classic regional breweries with pubs that were tied to it all across the south, especially in and around like South Oxfordshire and Berkshire. It was a dependable cask bitter and really recognisable for its house yeast character. It had a slightly fruity, softly rounded, unmistakable flavour, and a flavour that really started my affection for beer and the realisation that beer could be more than just generic lager. Now, a big part of that character came from how the beer was fermented. Brakspear became known for its double drop system, later refined into what people often called a triple fermentation. Rather than leaving the beer in one vessel from start to finish, the fermenting work was allowed to rise, the krausen came up, fermentation kicked off, and then at that key point, the beer was dropped from one fermenter into a secondary about halfway through fermentation. Now, that movement did a few things. It roused the yeast, it encouraged healthy fermentation, it also stripped out some of the harsh elements that were being created and helped create a clean but gently fruity profile that Brakspears were known for. Now, this notion sits in the same family of ideas as the Burton Union systems that we learnt about last year when visiting Thornbridge. In Burton Unions, the breweries that were using them had connected casks, troughs that let the yeast rise, the foam spill out over the top into these troughs, and then cleaner wort was then fed back down into the fermenting vessels. And it was a physical management of fermentation live whilst it was happening. Now, the connection between that and the double drop or the triple drop method that Brakspears used is very similar. Different hardware, slightly different method, but the same philosophy. Both approaches were about shaping flavour by working with the yeast in a very deliberate, hands-on way, rather than simply letting beer sit untouched in a single tank that many of us do as homebrewers and the vast majority of commercial breweries do. Now, Brakspear's brewed like this in Henley for generations, and it became part of the brewery's identity and the identity of many of the pubs in and around the area that I grew up in. Now, that all came to an end in 2002 when the Henley Brewery closed after nearly 3 centuries. Brakspears being brewed didn't stop though. It moved to Wychwood at first, just west of Henley in Witney, where a modernised version of the drop system was built to try and hold on to that house character. And for a while, that lineage continued. But in 2023, Wychwood also closed, and production was absorbed into the wider Marston's production network. Today, the beer brands are still brewed, but on modern centralised kit, and the physical drop system, the thing that once defined how Brakspears tasted, is now part of history. And there's something a little bit sad about that. Not just for Brakspears, but because it's a story we've seen over and over again. Regional breweries with quirks, traditions, deeply local ways of working, gradually being folded into the bigger beer groups. Sites closed, processes simplified, efficiencies you know, all of those kind of things being put over and above the tradition behind the beer. Now the beer still exists, the brand still exists, the name still exists, but the soul that lives in the spaces between those old fermenters, for me, that's not quite there now. So with all this in mind, I thought to myself, why not have a go at this method? Why not try the drop fermentation process? What's the worst that could happen? It's actually quite achievable on a homebrew scale. You don't need a degree in engineering to build a bespoke Burton Union system, but it does capture a historical method that I've been itching to try out. That said, it goes against everything I've taught myself about modern homebrewing practices, and I'm running a real risk of both oxidizing a beer and ending up with something that just tastes like malt vinegar. Now, the process. My plan was to brew a batch of Brakspears from our recipe that's on the website, pitch the yeast and wait for around 48 hours for the beer to reach high Krausen, and then I drop the beer from one fermenter into another. Importantly, I was going to be leaving behind the Krausen, the yeast slurry and any trub in that first vessel, and I opted to use our Grainfather GF30s for this because they've got that central spike that meant that I was able to draw the wort out, or the beer, somewhere in between the two, draw the wort out, leave behind any slurry at the bottom, and also be able to physically look inside the fermenter and think, right, I'm about to hit the Krausen, I'm going to turn off the flow. That being said though, this method could be achieved on almost any style of fermenter that you've got at home, even plastic buckets. But the important thing here was that we were going to reoxygenate the wort in the process and give the yeast that's in suspension a bit of a supercharge, right? Boosting it to finish fermentation cleanly and quickly. Now for my yeast selection on this, I chose one of the Brew Lab yeast slopes. I opted for the Thames Valley 1 strain, which should perform very well for this kind of beer, and as it comes from the Thames Valley, it may well share some attributes with the original Brakspear strain. It may not, I don't know, we'll see. So I pressed on with Brew Day, built up the yeast slope into a starter that I could pitch at the end, had the wort in the fermenter with a gravity of 1042, pitched the yeast slurry, patiently waited. And after 48 hours, the beer had already dropped to around 1018, so fermentation was well and truly underway. This was very much faster than I thought it would be, and that it fueled some of the self-doubt that I had about the whole process. But nonetheless, I pushed on, stuck true to my guns. Whilst maybe I'd missed that perfect window of about 50% of the fermentation being completed, I know I still had a few points to go, so I thought, right, let's just crack on. Let's get this done. What will be, will be. Now the actual drop, that part of the process was both simple and nerve-wracking. And it's worth noting at this point that this is not the same as transferring beer from a primary fermenter into a secondary fermenter. That process always tends to happen right at the end of fermentation, and you are trying to avoid oxygen contact at all costs when you're transferring from a primary into a secondary. It's the same as when you're trying to keg a beer or bottle a beer. You know that oxygen is going to cause you problems if you get it in contact with the beer. With the drop fermentation though, we're actively introducing oxygen to help drive the final phase of fermentation. Like I said, give that yeast a supercharge. So whilst I was draining the wort from one fermenter into the other, I was not being gentle, but I wasn't being really vigorous. It wasn't like when you transfer from the kettle, say, into the fermenter before pitching your yeast at the end of brew day, but I was still allowing enough oxygen to get intermingled in there and like really aerate things. Now there was obviously the risk of infection as well, which scared me a little bit, so I obviously made sure that everything was clean and sanitized before making the transfer. Now after the transfer was done, the beer finished fermentation super quickly, only about another 48 hours before it reached a stable final gravity of around 1010. From there I followed my standard approach for these beer styles, adding brow salt for 48 hours, then move into a soft crash of around 14 degrees just to help clear the beer before transferring it into a keg. I don't tend to cold crash these style of beers, but I do think that a soft crash just helps to drop anything out that might be sat there that you want to just get rid of before putting it into a keg, bottle, cask, whatever you're planning to do. Now I gave it a light carbonation just to around 1 volume because my plan here is to serve this on a beer engine just to try and replicate that cask style. Then it's been sat in the fridge for a week, just conditioning, which I think is gonna mean that we're in a position where we've got a drinkable beer, I guess. We'll see, right? I think that is plenty about the brewing process and the methodology behind this. Let's dive into tasting this beer and see whether I've ended up with something that is really good, surprisingly good, okay, and there's no distinguishable sort of difference maybe. And then thirdly, whether it's turned to vinegar or not and an oxidized mess. We'll find out. Let's get the beer engine hooked up and pour a pint.
You said to come out of the office, you need a hand with something. What you got going on, James? You're not going to get me to clean this dirty brass on this beer engine, are you?
No, that's a job for me at some point. But yeah, I brought my beer engine in from home because you know the Brakspear clone that I've been fettling around with over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and basically waxed lyrical about it for like years.
Well, yeah, I'm waxed lyrical about the beer, but this particular method, the drop fermentation, this kind of link back to the historical brewing practices of regional breweries that I've been really keen to try out since we visited Thornbridge and Richard at Wheatlow and talked loads about their union sets.
Okay.
So this is the Brakspear clone which I did the drop fermentation on. We're about to try it, okay? We're about to see whether I've just created malt vinegar or whether I've actually managed to create something that harkens back to that delicious pint that I remember from like my late teens and early 20s. Right, I'm going to pour you a pint, all right?
Let's get on with it. Sparkler on there, James.
Yeah, wouldn't really get a sparkler on a beer down south, certainly in South Oxfordshire of a regional brewery.
I say, I do like one myself there.
Yeah, I'm all about the sparkler life.
It's looking very brown.
There you go, mate. That one's for you. Look at that lovely cascading.
It is quite hypnotic watching the kind of like the cloud dissipate and kind of turn into amber, kind of browny liquid.
Yes, I'm really pleased with that whole serve. You know, just the right carbonation level, that beautiful cascading. Now yours is clearing down more than mine. It's not quite as clear or as bright as I would like. I think maybe, you know, it could do with a few more days sat conditioning in the keg, but
and also not travelling from downstairs to upstairs from the chiller downstairs.
Yeah, well, that doesn't.
That's
help.
never going to help,
No,
is it?
No. Lovely colour, sort of glorious head on there. You know, I'm really pleased with how it looks, and it certainly looks the part. Now, Brakspear does have a little touch of black malt in there, just to darken the colour down. But it's a really drinkable beer. Starting gravity was only 1042, and it finished at 1010. So it's light, sessionable. It's a bitter. It's not a best bitter.
Mm-hmm. Well, to be honest, that black malt trick is what I do with the Boy Taylor recipe. That's got that in there as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Just for a little bit of colour.
Yeah, right, cheers.
Sorry, I'm really wanting to smell it.
Right, have a sniff. Doesn't smell like vinegar.
No.
Smells malty. A little bit fruity. Going in for a sip?
Ratio.
Here goes nothing.
By heck, James, that ain't bad actually.
Well, first things first.
Lacing.
Yeah, well, first things first, it's not vinegar.
No, it's not vinegar.
It's not oxidised. That's... I'm going to have to go in for some more. That's delicious.
That's pretty damn tasty.
You were a bit sceptical.
Well, yeah, it's just a brown beer, isn't it? A little bit more clarity would be great on there, but yeah, you could smash pint after pint with this.
Yeah, I was so sceptical. I really thought I'd missed that sweet spot with that window of like dropping the fermentation from one vessel to the other. But we haven't oxidised it, and the key thing here was that fermentation like ripped through. Mm-hmm. I think it was 4 days to get down to terminal gravity.
Because you're discarding parts of the yeast that you don't want, or
yeah, you're getting rid of the yeast trub, so you're not going to run the risk of autolysis showing through. You're getting rid of the krausen as well, which, whilst there's a lot of active yeast in there as well, the really good stuff I've read is in suspension in the beer, so that's what you want to try and keep. And if you think about the Burton Union is skimming that foam off the fermentation throughout the whole time it's the wort's fermenting, right?
Okay.
So it's that same thing of like potentially trying to take the corners off and having a more rounded beer through managing your fermentation in a, well, to be quite honest, a pretty eccentric way.
Right, now answer me honestly. Did you put Brassol in this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
so you've used findings like you would typically find in a cask.
Yeah, absolutely. I just opted for vegan findings because that's what my preferred method is.
Do you think you could have achieved this without doing the double drop method thing that you did, or whatever you've called it?
Yeah, well, it's drop fermentation,
okay.
Martin.
Would it have tasted just as good if you just whacked in and fermented and left it?
I brewed this recipe before, but it was a while ago, so I can't categorically say to you, you know, it tastes as good as or better than. I could have done a control, but this was about, first of all, validating whether the process was going to work and whether I was going to oxidise the beer beyond all hope of recovery or end up with something that wasn't drinkable. I've completely ruled that out. This is an absolutely delicious cask pint. I mean, look at that head, Martin. We've been stood here talking for a good 5 minutes, far longer than we normally would with a pint in our hand.
And longer than they've actually seen on camera because of the forklift in and out.
Yeah, the forklift is bringing a malt delivery in, which is if you're hearing some beeping in the background. But that head, it's just not going anywhere. You know?
It is pretty solid, it's pretty good. The lacing's holding on the glass. It is kind of making me think pub, beer, cask.
For me, this is a beer garden beer. This is spring afternoons in the sun, couple of pints, you know, not like a long session, but just a couple of pints sat in the sun before the sun goes in, and then head home for maybe something a bit stronger.
It's a really tasty beer. You know, it's really drinkable. There's not much more I can say about it. I'm just like, I'm not totally convinced about your experiment if it's added to it or not, because I haven't tried it before, but it's made a tasty beer. So I'm kind of interested to learn a little bit more about it. Well, maybe when they finish playing around on the forklift bringing that malt delivery in, someone else might like to have a pint.
Yeah, right. Anyway, thanks for your feedback, Martin.
Cheers, James.
Cheers.
I might take this to my desk with me. Thank you.
Right, here you go, Mark.
Here we go. This looks suspiciously like my old beer engine, actually.
It is, Mark. It's the one you gave me. Yeah, I thought bring it back in, give you a pint through it, you know,
Fantastic.
see how it's getting on. Anyway, cheers, Mark.
Cheers.
Now, I know I've bored you to death about this this particular project as well. It's been a bit of a love affair for me. I'm really keen to see what you think of the beer. Now, how do you think it looks first and foremost?
Well, it's poured really nicely through the beer engine.
Yeah, sparkler, obviously.
Yeah. Beautiful tight head.
How's it smell?
Smells nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Smells like a brown beer. Yeah.
It does. Smells like cask ale. Right. Should we go in?
Cheers, mate.
Yeah. Cheers.
I mean, I've nearly had a pint, so. What do you reckon?
That's really quite nice. It's, yeah, really rounded and smooth. Definitely got, yeah, the sort of English bitter quality about it. It's nice. And,
Yeah. It tastes like proper pub beer, doesn't it? You know, and I know that that's always a thing you chase when you're trying to replicate kind of cask style beer at home because you're not serving from a cask. But it's really got that notion to it.
Yeah, no, I can. Yeah, it just immediately brings back images of sitting in a pub garden with a pint of cask beer from the bar. Yeah.
Yeah, something local, something regional.
Yeah.
I'm thoroughly pleased with it. Obviously, the thing that's made the whole process is your beer engine that you gave me a few years ago. But I think that the drop fermentation, can I say whether it's made a difference? I don't have a control here, but it's certainly something I would try again.
Yeah, well, I think it's worked out really well. It's smashing.
There you go. That's it for me. You know, I think that's the praise I needed. Nice one. Cheers, Mark.
Cheers.
You can take that back to your desk, pack a few boxes and enjoy the rest of it, all right?
Cheers.
So in summary, what did I achieve? Well, I managed to brew a beer. That was the first thing. I wanted to make sure I could actually brew a beer and that this method wasn't going to create something that was undrinkable. And this beer is anything but undrinkable. What was the other thing I wanted to achieve? Well, it would have been nice to have done a side-by-side, brewed this beer in a traditional, I say traditional, in a more kind of sanitary way, single fermentation vessel, no drop, to compare them side by side, serve both on cask, see how it turned out. I could have done that, but what I wanted to do was try and do something for me, something a bit historical, something with a bit of nostalgia attached to it, and hopefully experiment with something that I've never tried before and end up with a beer that, well, I think is delicious. And whether it actually is delicious or whether it's the nostalgia and kind of those memories flooding back, I don't know. I'm really pleased with this beer. And you know what? Why not try it yourself? Why not grab one of the kits for either this or your favourite local, regional, traditional beer, something you enjoy on cask? Give this a go. It's super easy. And every time you do it, know that actually what you are doing is reviving just that little bit of brewing heritage at your home. Anyway, I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts. Drop them down below. As ever, make sure that if you're not already, subscribe to our channel, hit the bell for notifications so you can stay up to date with everything we're doing here, and give this video a thumbs up. And as ever, have a great brew. Cheers, everyone.